even after Dobbs' decision. I mean, Jen and I were on a call with one of our pollsters he said, I can't exactly remember what he said, but it was definitely in the vein of, you don't want to touch this, it's a third rail. And I was like, wait a second. I like interrupted the entire briefing because I was like, do we have alignment here? Because we are absolutely using this moment to to organize people into action.
Yeah.
And it was later, like 2 or 3 days later, he was on TV using our talking points. And I was like, see?
Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us on pilot episode number 2 of Charting the Way Forward, where we deliver research-informed strategy and intelligence from across the winning Democratic coalition. For all you political junkies, operatives, and journalists out there, welcome. Today, we are going to bypass the doom and gloom forecasting to bring you hope and inspiration. That's right. And to do that, we will revisit two very recent instances in which the pro democracy, anti MAGA coalition met with serious adversity and triumphed. I'm your host, Kerry Eleveld, and I'm joined today by Way to Win's co founders.
Hi, I'm Tory Gavito, president of Way to Win.
Hi, I'm Jenifer Fernandez Ancona, Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer of Way to Win.
All right. And this podcast is produced by the Democratic Donor and Strategy Hub, Way to Win, where we aim to upend politics as usual. So the doom and gloom is taking hold a little bit. I have to say, wildly uninformed narratives about the early vote are flying. Republicans are swamping the polls, the polling averages with a bunch of cooked polls, a lot like 2022, if people remember that. Only, frankly, more aggressively now. They're inundating those polling averages with right wing and right leaning polls. The Cook political report has moved some of their ratings to less favorable territory for Democrats, just like they did in 2022 before the supposed red wave. And some national Democrats appear to be in the grip of despair. So instead of handicapping a race that's really a dead heat and only to ultimately conclude it's a statistical toss up. I mean, you can go to basically any punditry podcast and get that podcast if you want it. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to do something more constructive. Talk about how far this coalition has come in just 4 years, a coalition so broad, emergent, and powerful that even a decade ago, no one could have predicted it, and how we all have personal agency to shape our futures. And to do that, we're going to use two specific examples of when doom was supposedly upon us and we rose above it together as a coalition. This is an empowerment story set in very recent history. It's all about our ability as individuals to shape the conditions we're working in. So, story number one, Washington, D.C., early 2021. It's the outset of the 2022 midterm cycle. Democrats converge on Washington. And Jenifer, I know you were there. What was the mood?
Yes, so this was actually in the beginning of the 2022 year. So it was actually in the midterm year. Of course, early 2021, we were still dealing with, insurrectionists storming the Capitol.
There's always a
So,
twist, always a twist.
so, a bunch of us on our team were taking a trip because we had just spent a bunch of time actually in the later part of 2021 doing a ton of deep research. So actually throughout all of 2021, we did a really big research study like, okay, let's understand the Biden coalition. What makes these voters tick? Because when Biden got elected in 2020, it was from a big, diverse coalition of voters from all different walks of life, from white working class to Black voters in cities to young people and older folks, et cetera. So we wanted to understand what connects these people actually. How do we understand this new coalition that we saw form? And so we worked with Worthy Strategy Group and actually Future Majority, which was a different group that we hadn't worked with before that had a lot of connections. And we had done this study of, I think it was maybe about 200 voters, this like deep qualitative listening to them and understanding, the why behind the what. And we then had created a memo and had a bunch of findings around this is how we can unite this coalition. So we wanted to go to DC to talk to folks to share these learnings, as we were heading into the midterms. And we were all very struck by the mood of DC where it felt like we had already lost. I mean, it was literally February and everybody was so down in the dumps. And several people in our group kept commenting, what is going on here? What is happening? Why is everyone so depressed? Like this town needs to buck up. Like why are you guys
And
giving up
Jen,
already? Yeah,
February, like in context, you still had 8 months before anyone was going to like cast a vote. There was like 8 months
exactly.
to do something different.
Exactly. It was really early. So we were a little bit shocked by that, but we persevered. We talked with a lot of the party committee groups, the DCCC, the DSCC, the DNC. We had made all these briefings to everyone that we possibly could to say, this election is totally winnable. This coalition wants to come back again. And here are the things that, we need to talk about in order to do that.
Okay. So what else happened? Tory, I know that you wrote a memo, or was it a legal brief? What else I mean,
I
I'm
know.
unclear.
You
I know
know,
I just to be clear for our viewers, I'm relatively new to Way to Win, or our listeners. So like I wasn't there when they were doing this. I was still just writing about things. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Way to Win has three co-founders, and one of them, Leah Hunt Hendricks, is an academic. Jen Ancona is a journalist and that's her background is in journalism, and I am a lawyer by trade. And so I often joke, an academic, a lawyer, and a journalist walk into a bar and create an organization. What do? They write a lot of paper. There are reams of paper that analyze the context, that get into polling, that talk about our theory of change, that build our organization, just tons of paper. But in 2021, I really think you have to put into context the 2022 midterms. So 2021, 2020, we win. And not, it was a fight, there was COVID conditions.
Yeah.
The game had to totally shift all of their tactics, while there was like a serious, formidable backlash to Trump. There's also a serious, formidable movement behind Trump. There's something real in this country that supports MAGA, right? So
Yeah.
21, you have Georgia send a senator to DC. You have an insurrection, and then suddenly Biden is inaugurated and is starting to build his governing platform. And the majority of sort of the mainstream media that had been, we're seeing it now, right? Like you can't turn on the news without the media condemning the kind of rhetoric that was used at Madison Square Garden this weekend at the Trump rally.
Yeah.
Um, but the second it was the Biden administration, that consensus that racist tropes are not what we want in America was gone. And there was a real series of debates and pundits like starting to pick apart the progressive coalition and our policy desires, right? So um, it got really complicated really quickly. And in that environment, part of my job is to monitor the resources and make sure there is enough resource to keep organizing, keep shaping the narratives, keep our coalition together through a governing phase and into winning by 2022. And everywhere I went, I saw these deep divisions, whether it was in the ecosystem of actors whose job it is to organize people, or whether it's the donor class that moves resources to make sure movements are whole and mobilization efforts are whole and narrative efforts get funded. There's deep division. People were feeling like we just did all this work and we can't get major voting rights passed. Like there was a lot of like just feeling badly about how much it had taken to defeat MAGA and then not feeling the spoils of the victory quick enough. Of course, we now know later Biden has a great legacy to point back to in terms of his governing agenda, but in that moment, I think people wanted more faster relief or faster change or something.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's exactly right, because that was one of the findings from this big study that we had done of these gettable voters was people wanted more change. Like we asked them, have you gotten enough change from what you thought Biden was going to give you or not enough? And across the board, it was like almost unanimous. All these voters are saying they wish Biden was giving them more change. So that is 100% spot on. That was one of the challenges that we were facing definitely in that moment around how do you communicate and sort of raise the saliency of the things that of the wins, because even at that time, like Tory's point, Biden hadn't achieved all those wins, but he had achieved some wins, and even those were totally unknown to voters. We also were finding at the time, and this was before Dobbs, that we were saying gettable voters are angry at the GOP around reproductive rights. They were angry about the Texas decision. They were angry about what the Supreme Court looked like they were doing even before the Dobbs decision came down. And we were trying to tell people abortion is the most mobilizing issue we have seen for this base. And we were literally getting like eye rolls at the time.
I
Yeah.
yeah.
So Jen and I came together, like her experience in DC, which frankly tends to be the experience in DC, like it's an environment that gets a little conservative really quickly. And then my experience, like moving among the movers and shakers of the activist class, um, I realized we had to put together a case. And initially, it was a case for hope. Just have hope that there's more that can be done, that we can win in 2022. And we changed it
Right.
to action because it's actually it doesn't matter even if you feel like the odds are against you, you still need to move. Like the worst thing you can do is just not do anything. And
Right.
that leads to defeat. I mean, that's a sure bet for losing. And so
Yeah.
uh, we
But it
put
was
together,
also
yeah.
people telling us that, right? Like we had advisors telling us, oh, you can't tell people there's hope because there's no hope.
Quit it.
So
Quit it with all
it,
that hope stuff. It's horrible.
but it ended up being the right call, I think, because that what Tori's saying is exactly right, especially with the people we were trying to motivate. It was like, no matter if you think there's no hope or not, there's definitely a case for action. And I remember us using that refrain and Tori really leaning into that when we released the memo.
I have to go back to the memo, but I do think it was like I did use my legal training to formulate the memo in terms of like, okay, here's the goal.
Yeah.
Here's all the elements to how you win. And here's the current condition behind each element that shows us not all is lost. And let's just kind of plot forward in this plan. And yeah, and I think history has proven us right.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to hear you guys talk about that. Also to hear Jen talk about how, I mean, I just know this as someone who covered a lot of cultural issues and whatever, that Democrats have been afraid of the abortion issue forever, forever,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
considered it a loser, a cultural loser, for the longest time. Just along with immigration and the border and LGBTQ equality, all of that stuff. They were all like third rail, considered to be third rail type of issues. So the fact that you were trying to sell them on this before the Dobbs decision came down, I can just imagine the type of shade you were getting. Tori, how
Yeah.
Oh,
was,
oh,
yeah,
even after Dobbs' decision. I mean, Jen and I were on a call with one of our pollsters he said, I can't exactly remember what he said, but it was definitely in the vein of, you don't want to touch this, it's a third rail. And I was like, wait a second. I like interrupted the entire briefing because I was like, do we have alignment here? Because we are absolutely using this moment to to organize people into action.
Yeah.
And it was later, like 2 or 3 days later, he was on TV using our talking points. And I was like, see?
Yeah, I mean, it was
win.
like a little, there's always this false choice, and it happened in the midterms when people were saying can't be only about abortion, it should really be about economy, or even like it can't be about abortion, it should be about the economy. And we've always been saying that's a false choice. It has to be about both. And that has really been the work that we've done to get ready for this 2024 cycle, is to make clear that it's a story that includes both of those things, and that we can't just be constantly being told it can only be one or the other.
And
Yeah,
then
and
I just
go
have to
ahead.
jump in though. Like that's why this weekend, so on Friday, we're recording this on a Tuesday right before Kamala's closing argument tonight in Washington, D.C. Friday, I went to the Houston event with Vice President Harris, a number of surrogates who have had their own reproductive health stories, right? And Beyonce, of course. But there was a moment, there were a number of Texas women who have been impacted by the Dobbs decision, and of course, Texas adding fuel to that fire with its own
And
restrictions.
you're a seventh generation Texan,
And I am
just
a
for
first
every, yeah.
generation Texan. And I was so emotional. I was crying. And on the stage in this giant venue, 30,000 people, it's like a venue for, it's a sports arena. I'm sure it's never seen an event like that before. But all of the signs, all of the big staging and lights, it was all about reproductive freedom, reproductive health, just to see this issue that we worked on back in 2021, 2022, center stage in a big old red state like Texas was so moving. It's just, we've come a long way.
Right.
Yeah.
And for people who, I mean, this is something Tory said in a statement, right, following, but for people who don't understand why you would go to Texas, it's because Texas is ground zero for what this nation could become if, like Greg Abbott has the keys to the kingdom and Republicans have the keys to the kingdom in Texas, you give those keys nationally to people like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. So just to wrap this section up real quick, let's just remember how well Democrats ended up doing in the midterms, right? And it was the Republicans at the outset were favored to retake control of the Senate. And even by the end, as we got closer and the polling was showing that it was really tight, they were still had a slight edge on the Senate. And instead, Senate Democrats expanded their majority by a single seat. In the House, far from the sweeping losses that would give Republicans a 20 to 30 seat majority. They took the House by just a handful of seats, which totally hobbled them in terms of having a functional majority for the past couple of years. And in the states, Democrats won key gubernatorial races in places like Arizona, which is in play, and it's much better to have a Democratic governor there than a Republican one, and not to mention a Democratic attorney general, and flipped 5 state legislatures. So, and then we went on to win and basically overperform in basically every special election since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. So, it's just been, it's just been kind of an amazing go, to be honest. So let's uh let's move on to story number two. This is another story of the coalition triumphing themselves into a better situation, right? A better political atmospherics. Fast forward to the summer. It's July 28th, the day after the first debate between President Biden and Donald Trump. And Biden had just an incredibly poor performance. There's no way around it. And the question for everyone in the pro-democracy, anti-MAGA coalition was, what do we do about that? And I want to let Tory weigh in here about what that discussion looked like at Way to Win.
Oh, goodness. Um,
In two sentences or
I know.
less, Tory, two
The
sentences or
summer,
less.
the summer was just a wild time because everything leading up to the June debates and then the July Democratic debate
Mhm.
internally was just really challenging. The resources were sort of drying up because people felt like we were losing. The polling was getting worse and worse. It was a really scary time to feel like our coalition wasn't locked in. Um, like we could have elected anyone if we lock in. I believe we can, our coalition is strong. Our Democratic leadership is strong. Our plans are generally strong and right. I mean, we don't do everything perfect. The royal we doesn't do everything perfect, but for the most part, like we're on track. And I felt like we could win, but we couldn't win if we were all divided, right? Like if some part of the camp was like, he shouldn't be running, if some part of the camp was playing fantasy football with random names from people that they wished were running, the camp needs to get locked in. And so that was where we were at a time that we were watching a number of debates among serious power players that were totally skipping Kamala's name. And
Hmm.
that's not gonna fly. Like for a number of reasons. One, as like a woman of color political operative who has deep relationships with women of color across the country who work so hard to just skip the woman who's in close proximity to the Oval is just that's not how you hold your coalition either. Um,
Hmm.
so there was that factor. Um, yeah,
I
Jen
would,
was waiting to do. Jump in.
well, I would go, I'll go back a little bit farther too, because we actually, one of our stakeholders kind of early on in the cycle said to us, what are you guys gonna do if like something happens to Biden? And we were like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. So we actually created this fund called the Black Swan Fund. And that was like Tory's idea for we don't know, the cycle's gonna be wild. We went through the insurrection. We have no idea what's gonna happen. So we might as well create a little cushion of a fund so that we can move. And we did use it early on some of the third party questions because that was like a big black swan sort of issue. What if there's five, different candidates on the ballot splitting the vote? And actually, we used it early on to do some research on Kamala because when all of the uncommitted vote stuff was happening in the early part of the primary cycle, we flagged, this is a concern. We're hearing from a lot of people on the ground, the concern. We're seeing the numbers and the uncommitted vote in swing states like Michigan. And we put out a research-backed kind of memo again saying, this is like a clarion call. We need to listen to this. And one of the things that we said was, nobody knows about Kamala. We actually need to uplift her a little bit more. Like when we did this initial early research, just that call where we're asking people about it, when we talked to our coalition and especially Gen Z, they literally came back and said, we know absolutely nothing about her. She's essentially invisible to us. So she had a universal name ID, but no one could repeat anything basically back about what she was about or what she cared about or what her portfolio was. We had heard that reflected back from Emily's List too, which for a year had done some research on that. So I think we were kind of
And
prepared
when they
too,
learned
right?
about her too, wasn't it true that when they learned about her, her favorables shot up? It's like
Yeah.
just increasing her favor, like just telling her profile, it shored up elements of our coalition.
Yeah.
Jump in.
Absolutely. So we were kind of seeding this idea in probably February of 2024, did some initial research. And then when the debate happened, because we had already done a little bit of that seeding, we had also prepared to do a poll. We had wanted to do a battleground state poll to just get a little more data. There was very little data about Kamala's political strength. We had a poll ready to go. And then when the debate happened, I called the pollster and was like, hit go. And so we did a poll. We did a poll the week of July 4th. So everyone was on holiday. We were doing a poll in the field in battleground states. And it was really interesting because we really tried to understand the whole picture, but we really wanted to understand how does our own coalition feel about this? So we did a deeper dive with Democrats and independents. That's our anti-MAGA coalition, and found in that her strength was there. Like she was doing much better with young people, with Black voters, with Latino voters in particular than Biden was doing. And at the time too, like Tori's saying, it was a hard needle to thread. But after a lot of conversations, we also knew we could say Biden should step down, but Biden was, that wasn't in our power. We understood that he was going to make that decision himself, but we wanted to be able to move forward because it's hard when you have that inertia and that kind of feeling like no one can do anything because everyone is like not sure what to do. So
Back to
we
action. Back to
yeah,
action.
action, forward motion, like we have the power. And so we decided, after I think even before we looked at the poll results, like we can just make the case for Kamala to be stronger. And because we were hearing all of this sort of like, well, yes, Biden should step down, but no, not Kamala. I mean, we heard that a lot.
A
So
lot.
it was like a knee-jerk response that we were like, we have to come to this conversation with data. And that was why we wanted to do the poll.
And then also, regardless of Biden's decision, then we could, I mean, I was making the case for playing doubles tennis. Like, if you can play tennis with two people, why are you going out in the court with one when your
Right.
partner's got a strong, has a strong play, you know?
Yeah, and if people
And
are concerned about Biden, they need to feel really good about Kamala. She's his vice president. And regardless of what Biden was going to decide, we knew Kamala had to be strong. And we also knew Biden is loyal and he was going to endorse her if he ever were to step down. We knew that. So we were trying to build up the case that Kamala is viable. She is politically strong. She can win. I mean, I have an email from my own inbox to our coalition in June 30th saying Kamala can also win, if we do the right things. And I even said if she picks a good vice president like Tim Walz. So all of those things happened and it kind of got us to this place where everyone re-energized and, we were able to move forward.
it's worth remembering too that Kamala was the best messenger far and away on the ticket on abortion and reproductive freedom, which
For sure.
was, which is the issue on which Democrats have overperformed in every special election since Dobbs. So anyway, just bring that up. Tori,
That
did you
was
have
one
something
of
else?
our
Yeah, sorry.
points.
Yeah, yeah.
No, go for it, Tori.
Oh, I was just gonna share that. I guess I want to share like a little more flowers for Biden too. Just this particular
Right.
election season has been unlike any I've ever worked in the decade plus I've been in a political operative, and he came to Austin. Everybody's come to Texas this year, and he came to Austin shortly after his decision to speak at the LBJ Library on the anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And I was like, I'm going to be there for that. That's like some serious Texicana that I'm not going to miss. And the ovation he got. This was after his decision. This was when Kamala had launched, and there was this major vibe shift. And the crowd at the LBJ was not Gen Z. They were a older, more conservative, kind of old school Texas Democrat crowd, and they were just enthralled to with thanks for him and stood up for a long time clapping. So I don't know, it's
Mhm.
just a wild experience that I think at the end of the day was the right one, and I think he deserves a
Yeah.
strong mark in the history books for his decisions.
Well, you were saying that, Tori, like in the whole, in this time, you were saying like Biden's legacy is pretty incredible in terms of creating a path and lifting up other women of color, like putting Ketanji Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court, choosing Kamala as his vice president. Like he really did an incredible thing in, opening up those paths and making it possible. And we wanted that to be his legacy. Like that's part of why we wanted to push forward with this boosting Kamala strategy was in a way to like give him the credit for the legacy that he actually did
He
put
he
forward.
absolutely has been a bridge from if you take him as the vice president and supporting cast member to Barack Obama to winning the election and defeating Trump and MAGA in 2020, and then handing over, and building a bridge to a new generation of leaders and a first woman of color nominee for the Democratic Party, woman and woman of color nominee for the Democratic Party. So I just want to, one interesting note, that poll, like we get so many polls. You're probably like, it's one poll in a million polls that come out. I just want to be really clear. We pull, I mean, to hear Jen talk about pulling the trigger on, July 4th on that, on going into the field over that holiday weekend, that is like the desert of polling. Basically, very few people do polling in that time frame. They wait until people are back from their vacations and whatever, and they do the polling to, all the candidates, their own internal polling, stuff like that. Usually happens after that weekend. And the reason I tell you that is because that poll ended up getting nearly 30 press hits. Now, we are not really like, I mean, I'm the director of external communications, so we were going to get a ton of press going forward, but we don't always like, not all of our polls and all of our memos and whatever, considering how much we produce, like gets as much traction as 30 press hits. But like, people were hungry for that information about how Kamala Harris could perform, how she could help shore up the coalition among the very people that Biden was actually kind of losing in terms of independents and people of color, Gen Z voters, et cetera. So it ended up being incredibly, getting a lot of action because people were hungry for the information, and it came in a period when there really just weren't any polls showing the same thing. So anyway, kudos. I wasn't there to make that decision, but I'm always happy to ride the coattails of success. So
So Carrie, I know that we're like kind of nearing the end of our conversation.
yes.
And I know that you would have advised me to challenge the premise of your question well before the 30-minute mark of this conversation. But I want to challenge the premise of this, like at the start of your setup for the whole conversation was this doom and gloom has set in. And I don't want to dispute that there has, but it's a bit of a roller coaster. And our media cycle just moves so fast now. Like anything that you feel or sets in as the narrative for the day, give it 6 hours and the mood's gonna shift in a minute. And so I wonder though, like I am feeling more hope. Um,
Yeah.
I
I
think
am
that
too.
the
I am too.
closing, yeah, the closing argument tonight is going to be really interesting contrast. There was a book, there are bookends between um the Madison Square Garden rally, right? So on
Yeah.
Friday you have Beyonce saying, "America, it's time to sing a new song." And it was just this
Hmm.
beautiful
I love
message
that.
that feels real. And then we heard a real old song this
Mm.
weekend from Madison Square Garden from the Trump people, like a really old song, like a song as old as the hills. I mean, I don't even want to give life to the words that were spoken on that stage, but like
Yeah.
racism was old and tired, and the misogyny was old and tired. And now we have tonight, right? And the way the media, and I think the way that the electorate, from what I can tell from polling and focus groups and the conversations, is responding to that contrast is the right direction.
Totally.
It's the right direction. Yeah.
I agree 100%. Yeah, I think we went through a valley of doom and gloom at the very tail end, and I just think a lot of the work we're doing, from the grassroots, where we've elevated people who are just like, I know you guys are telling me it's doom, but I'm knocking the doors and there's energy, and we're seeing like all the TikTokers that we're working with who are just like pumping out positive vibes, every second of the day, and I think we overcame it, and I think we're heading into the final stretch with a lot of energy. People are voting, people are coming to this conversation being ready to turn the page and saying we're not going back.
I totally agree with that. And I would recommend for people to just turn off the prognosticators in the Beltway, right? They are all, first of all, it's I've lived there. I lived there for 5 years. It's a real nerdy bunch, and everybody likes to be in the in crowd and sound smart and cynical, right? This this is not the time. They all move as they kind of herd. It's a herd mentality. They move in one direction or they move in the other direction, but they usually all go together. And the input that they're responding to is the polls, and the polls right now are a lagging indicator. They're behind by about at least a couple weeks, if not 2 or 3 weeks. So I mean, I actually think the polls don't look bad. If you look at the good polls, the polls that are actually representative and not the junk polls that the right wing is pushing out, right? It's a very tight race. It's a very winnable race, and Kamala Harris is closing strong and lined up to win this thing. So I'm not saying that is a foregone conclusion. Everybody's got to find their neighbors and make sure they have a plan to vote. Everybody's got to call their friends and family in the, swing states and make sure they have a plan to vote. Or if they're Trumpers, talk them out of voting or whatever. But everybody's got to do their part. But I am completely in agreement with Tory. But if I'd set this whole conversation up that way, Tory, it would have been a real bummer because there would have been no tension. You got to have tension going in, got to have some tension. And the reality is that this is what we are hearing from the Beltway. It's not what, to Jen's point, it's not what our organizers are hearing on the doors. It's not, to Tory's point, it's not what you feel when you're in a stadium and you have Beyonce saying it's time to sing a new song, right?
Hmm.
Um, But that's what we're getting from the Beltway. And I say, turn that dial, go do your thing. I think it's a good place to leave it. I appreciate all of you joining us. We know your time is precious in this final week of the election. We appreciate you being engaged in the work of building democracy, which at its core is building coalitions and common cause across groups with different demographies and lived experiences. And we plan to drop at least one more pilot before the end of the year, a post-election recap of what we saw across the Democratic coalition. So please keep an eye out for that following the election. If you like what you've heard, please follow us on your podcast feed. Leave a review so we know what hit home and we can do more of it. And until next time, do good, be well, stay engaged, and let's go win this thing.
Thanks, Kerry. Thanks, Tory.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, guys.